Okay, so we're so lucky to have Daniel J. Bernstein, or DJB, who is a mathematician, cryptologist, and computer scientist. He's a research professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago and is a true world leader in cryptography. His advancements include the creation of Cha-Cha 20, Poly 1305, symmetric key methods, and is the inventor of Curve 25519. He's also been at the forefront of post-quantum cryptography and has led on the Sphinx Plus digital signature method and the McLeish key encapsulation technique. Daniel's also worked in the areas of lightweight cryptography and hashing, and you can find his work at cr.cyp.to or crypto. Good morning or good afternoon, Daniel.
How's it going?
Yeah. So, what's your current role and what does a typical day involve for you?
Well, I'm a research professor, so I mean, professors. There's a spectrum between like teaching courses for students and doing research to come up with new things. It's not a clear dividing line a lot of times between what you do in classes and what you do for new research. I mean, it's great to get students involved in research, but anyway, I'm a research professor, so I'm supposed to be focusing all my time on coming up with new stuff, which realistically day to day means a lot of reading to figure out what's been done before. I mean, of course, if somebody else has done something, then obviously I have to know that, so I'm not stealing credit for it. But it's more efficient to read something from somebody else. I mean, almost everything I know is stuff that somebody else figured out before I did. So it makes sense for me to save time by reading what they wrote instead of struggling through figuring it out myself. And then a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, a lot of writing, and then the end result is, well, papers, software, and then hopefully stuff that people find interesting.
Yeah, that's great. And if we go back to your school days, what were you like as a pupil at school?
So I was definitely interested in science and math and everything from very young age. I don't even remember not being interested. So like math classes, I would just be zooming through the material, like eagerly absorbing everything, and then kind of uh, ran out of stuff to learn in the math classes in school. But then I guess I was also maybe paying attention to some of the other classes. But I was always the nerdy kid going for I like science, like math, and it's always been fun.
Yeah, that's great. And what got you into cryptography in the first place?
Well, I remember very long time ago was reading a book which was explaining some crypto systems. It was generally about like different kinds of mathematics. I think maybe focusing on combinatorics and discrete mathematics. And then it was aimed at a general audience. So it was something, I don't remember how young I was, but I was able to read at least parts of it. And then one chapter was about a crypto system, actually the McLeish crypto system. And it was, I mean, there were some weird things going on there, and definitely more than I understood. But it was also fascinating, the whole spy versus spy. Like, I mean, so you can keep secrets that somebody else can't figure out, and then with public key cryptography, being able to keep secrets where you can talk secretly to somebody and never having shared a secret with them before, and you come up with a secret from a public conversation. Really amazing concept. And anyway, then was reading more and more. Math stuff and occasionally bumping into cryptography and really got sucked into cryptography at some point. When I was starting as a student and then in college and grad school, I was not spending most of my time on cryptography, in part feeling like it's something which is um, maybe dangerous to work on because at that point it was export controlled by the U.S. government. So I was spending maybe 10% of my time on cryptography at that point, but was definitely very interested in it. And I remember Neil Koblitz had a book on number theory and cryptography, and I remember I was reading that book. I was so interested in reading it that I didn't actually manage the first few days in the bookstore to buy it. It's not because I was trying to cheat the bookstore. I was just standing there eagerly reading through this book, and at some point realized, I really should buy this book, and so finally managed to drag myself away from the pages and buy it. And anyway, lots of people writing about cryptography. That's what got me interested in it.
Yeah, we've also talked to him, and he has such an interesting history. And obviously, he was the creator of, or the co-creator of elliptic curve cryptography, and he still teaches. I think it's at the University of Washington. Yeah, yeah. So he's still active, but he's inspired so many people in research in this area. So if we wind back to 1995, you brought a court case against the US against the restrictions, as you just talked about there in cryptography. What was the result of that action, and do you think you were actually successful?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, there were lots of efforts against what the U.S. government was doing. I think the general trade-offs that the government was explaining it as was, well, yeah, it's nice if people have strong encryption for protecting their data, but then, well, we'd really like to be able to see what the terrorists and what else, the child pornographers and money launderers, and there's just this list of bad people, and the government was saying, "Oh, we really need to figure out what those people are doing." Where I mean, I understand both sides of that sound like they make sense. The thing is that the terrorists are managing to communicate secretly, independently of what the U.S. government manages to do with cryptography controls, and so it's kind of silly what they were trying to do. The situation back then in the late 20th century, as they call it, is that the government had export controls saying that you can't export cryptographic software outside the US. And you also can't publish it inside the US because, well, somebody who's a foreigner might see it inside the US. And so realistically, it meant you couldn't say anything about cryptography. You couldn't show people cryptographic software. Actually, originally, the laws were saying you couldn't even tell people about cryptographic techniques. Like you couldn't even publish a paper. There was this NSA employee who was threatening people in the 70s for publishing cryptographic papers. And after enough politics, NSA backed down. But the law actually said you can't publish cryptographic papers. It wasn't just software at the beginning. But anyway, certainly by the 90s, they were still trying to stop cryptographic software from being published. And the court case was saying, there were multiple court cases. Again, it wasn't just me. But the theme of the court cases was, hey, there's this law which is saying that you can't publish software, and that's a violation of the U.S. Constitution. And legally, the case was certainly successful, 4 positive court decisions, and then the government gave up. Then in terms of the practical impact, well, by 1999, the government said, okay, we're just giving up on these export controls. I mean, they still formally they have a requirement that you have to like send them a copy of your cryptographic software when you put it online. I think most people don't even bother doing that at this point. I don't know how many people writing cryptographic software are even aware of this rule, but technically there's still this notification requirement. And anyway, so the government basically gave up, which I interpret as they realized that their argument doesn't actually make sense. I mean, that this whole stopping terrorists by preventing the distribution of cryptographic software, it just doesn't work. Whereas for normal people who are trying to communicate confidential information on the internet and trying to protect authenticity of their information, this is something where having cryptographic software published and reviewed and carefully designed, this is something which really can help us stop bad guys from intercepting our communications. So I think the balance there is very clear that one side is more important than the other. And well, legally, the court cases would make it very difficult for the government to try to put back the restrictions that they had last century.
And it caused many problems. I think many of the 0 days were caused by these restrictions in in key exchange methods and so on. So we're going to look at each of your papers and each of your core contributions later on, but which paper would you pick as your favorite paper that you published and why?
This is a tough one. I think my favorite one, actually, if I had to pick just one, then I have a paper from a long time ago, which is on a very, very conceptually simple algorithm where it's what I put in the paper was a little more complicated than what I'll say now. But the basic result was an algorithm which is saying, suppose you have a bunch of integers and you're trying to factor them. So you're trying to find like 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, which primes divide those numbers. And then suppose that the only factorization method that you have in mind is just trial division. You have a big number, try dividing it by 2, try dividing it by 3, and so on. And then, well, then you move on to the next number and try dividing it by 2 and 3 and 5 and 7 and so on. And then, okay, you figure that the total time you're going to spend is the total number of numbers you're looking at times the number of little primes that you're checking. And I mean, each number you check, each prime. And so what I'm doing in that paper is saying, well, actually, you just have to read all the data once and then do very small algorithm, which just somehow people missed before, but just a few lines, you can just read all the numbers and read all the things you're trying to divide them by, and then figure out which of those numbers divide which of those, which of the primes divide which of the numbers you started with. So you don't need to do quadratic time of the numbers times the primes. You can do it in essentially linear time. And that's something where it doesn't need to be just dividing by small primes. It can be dividing by anything. And there's, again, I did a little more work in the paper, but the basic idea is just that's what it accomplishes. And this has had various applications. And I think what makes me happy about this paper is that it's something which somehow I spotted this algorithm, and it's so short. It's something which, I mean, when people look at it and they say that's like, this is ridiculously short, simple algorithm, and it must have been discovered 1,000 years ago. And well, maybe it was, but I mean, I've looked around and nobody else seems to know a place where it's appeared before. I think I came up with it, and so I'm just happy with having noticed something which seems very simple, like it should have been around a long time ago, and somehow people have missed it.
That's great. Yeah, when we spoke to Marty Hellman, he actually showed us the desk that he created the Diffie-Hellman methods there, and he said it was quite simple, just discrete logs and the multiplication of them, but it changed the world really, and it opened up so many doors for it. So simplicity can be very good in research. So we'll have a look at Chacha 20. I've just got a quick question. Why do you name some of your methods after dances? You have salsa and cha-cha. What was the reason behind that?
There's a lot of discussions among cryptographers about how are you supposed to name your algorithms? What's the right way to put a name on something? I mean, of course, you don't want to use a name that's like bumping into a name that is people are at a conference about cryptography and they're talking to each other, and suppose you have an algorithm which is named after a person. And then, like, if you're talking to that person or you're talking about the algorithm, you can get confused. There's a little bit. I would say sometimes people go a bit too far in choosing names which are like really weird, so that nobody I mean, a good thing about having a weird name is nobody could possibly be using it for something else. The bad thing about a weird name is nobody can pronounce it. Sometimes it's long, complicated. Nobody can remember it. Like Rindal is the original name, Rijndael, the original name for AES. And it's something where maybe for Belgians it's pronounceable, but for the rest of the world it's hard to remember that name. And it was definitely an improvement in memorizability when they changed the name to AES, when it got selected as the advanced encryption standard. Okay, then there's sort of in the middle, people will have names like there's an algorithm called Smog after the dragon. And that's actually, it's an algorithm from Asian designers where I think in Asia, the culture says that dragons are good creatures. Then there's, of course, the Western interpretation where Smaug is, I mean,
Mm.
certainly in Lord of the Rings, Smaug is this evil dragon and scary. And then there's some names that are explicitly evil, like Lucifer is one of the oldest
Oh,
ciphers.
yeah.
And
Dense.
that's where, I mean, no question that Lucifer's a bad guy. Then there's other ciphers which have happier names. There's ciphers named after flowers and stuff. In the case of salsa and then later cha-cha, if you look at what's going on inside the algorithm and see the data flow and really visualize what's going on, for instance, if you work through it by hand or you have a computer plot what's happening in, say, 3 dimensions, then it's maybe a bit easier than doing it by hand. Then well, if you know how various Latin dances work, then you can actually see the similarity there. It's something where the steps that are happening inside salsa for an expert salsa dancer are reminiscent of the dance. I mean, there's of course little things that are different, but it I think it's closer to the data flow that you would imagine if you look at the dances and look at the data flow of different ciphers. This one is closer to a dance than most ciphers are. Cha-cha, also, if you know how cha-cha dances work with some cha-cha in the middle, then there's something going on inside the cha-cha cipher which is reminiscent of that. I'm not sure how many people would see the similarity if I weren't naming it explicitly, but that was the motivation.
Yeah, that's excellent. So obviously you talked about Rendal and AES. It became a standard with NIST. So what motivated you to create Cha-Cha 20 and Poly 1305? And did you have any idea how successful this would be, given the success of AES?
These went back. So the sort of starting ideas for my trying to design cipher already went back to like early 90s. Went through a lot of evolution, and I learned a lot from various designs. And in particular, learned quite a bit from AES itself, which was late 90s. And then I thought there were a few things which were motivating me to do something which was different from AES. And I would say the most important one is that when you implement AES, when you write software for AES, and you do it on a processor that, well, until many years later, processors didn't have AES built into hardware. Like there's a current Intel chip is going to have AES built into the CPU, and you just call an AES instruction, and then some hardware designer has done the work for you. But if you're on a chip which is older or smaller, often doesn't have AES built into the hardware, and then you have to write some software for it, then well, you end up using table lookup. So AES inside the way it's designed, the way that AES is designed to run fast on chips that don't have it built in, which is the situation when AES was designed. And again, it's still the situation for small CPUs. It relies very much on taking a byte, taking 8 bits, and using that as an index into an array. And then you look up one of 256 values depending on that byte. And that's something which takes a variable amount of time, depending on the index that you're using. And that index is something secret. And if somebody's carefully watching the time that you spend on an AES computation, then they can actually work backwards and figure out your key in some circumstance. And so I was looking at that and thinking, okay, this is something dangerous, and this is something which is going to have people, well, having their data exposed to timing attacks, where you have no way to know that a timing attack is happening. It's just, there's some cryptographic operations, and then your key is extracted. And some of the papers on this are saying you can, in milliseconds, the attacker can get your secret key out. And okay, so I wanted to do something which wasn't using table lookups. There were a few designs like that, like TEA, the tiny encryption algorithm. And that's something which I also found inspirational, but it was too small. That algorithm, I mean, the name refers to the code size is small, but it's also the key size wasn't big enough to make me comfortable. Various other features of it didn't feel like I was comfortable with that. And I also thought that if I didn't use table lookups, I could actually make something faster than AES, something using fewer bit operations than AES does. AES tries really hard to mangle each byte as it's looking it up in this table. It uses this inverse in F256. But that's something where okay, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of cipher design, but my feeling was that doing less mangling of sort of the local bits you're working with and working more on a big state is going to give you security more efficiently than AES does. And so, okay, putting all this together, then eventually, after 15 years of trying various cipher designs, came up with Salsa 20, and and yeah, I was certainly feeling like this is something which should be safer for people to use than AES. And um, of course, a lot of people make cryptographic decisions to just take the fastest thing that's out there. And so it's important that it's on some platforms that don't have AES in the CPU. Salsa 20 and Cha-Cha 20 are faster than AES is. And so they're sort of consistently fast across platforms, except, well, AES runs faster on a CPU that has it in hardware because the hardware is very fast. So anyway, I was thinking, yeah, I've got something which is good for people in terms of the safety profile, and it's reasonably fast across platforms. And so I was optimistic about it being deployed, and it has ended up being deployed in quite a few applications. So I'm happy to see that. I'm also happy to see that the AES safety issue has partially been dealt with by CPUs, which are putting AES into the hardware so that you can just use the hardware and then you don't have to worry about the timing.
Yeah. And obviously, some cryptographic methods have been held back through patents. So if we think of RSA was a very successful patent for its authors, and obviously the Diffie-Hellman method and Merkle and so on. But you've not went down that route, and you could have patented Cha-Cha 20, I would assume, and you would have been very rich from it, perhaps. Why didn't you take that route for your work?
So I've actually also from the early 90s been studying what happens with patents, and it's a real drag on cryptography having patents. So what happens? Sure, sometimes people who patent things make money off of it. The RSA patent certainly made a lot of money. When there's more options available, then it's the patents are not something which should make money in the sense that, well, somebody can just do something else. There's enough cryptography out there that somebody who has a new cryptographic idea, if they patent it, then other people will typically just look at that and say, oh, we'll do something else. The way that people still make money off cryptographic patents tends to be there's so many of these cryptographic patents that other people will not know about some of the patents, and then they'll accidentally bump into those patents, and then they'll end up, say, using something, locking themselves into using something which is actually patented. And then, okay, then people do end up making money off those patents. But it's a drag. It's something where RSA's patent, sure, it made a lot of money for the RSA inventors, but it also really slowed down the deployment of cryptography. It's something where for many, many years, people were having to do only what the RSA company said was okay in terms of deploying RSA. And it wasn't just the RSA patent. At the beginning, there was the Diffie-Hellman patent and the RSA patent. And both of those ended up delaying broad deployment of cryptography for about 20 years. And that's something where, from the perspective of the RSA company and public key partners and so on, the companies that were involved in licensing these patents, they would say, oh, we're building this huge marketplace for cryptography, and we're guiding the evolution of this ecosystem. But the reality is that cryptography was used much, much more after the RSA patent expired, and the Diffie-Hellman patent expired a bit before that, was used much more after the patents expired than before. And if those patents hadn't been there, then we would have had cryptography being deployed quite a bit earlier. Well, maybe not in the US and some other countries because of export laws, but there were various countries which, like Australia, which were fine with cryptographic software. And there would have been a lot more use of cryptography already I would say already in the 80s, certainly in the 90s when the cost was going down of doing computations. In the 90s, there would have been a ton of use of cryptography if it hadn't been for those patents, in particular public key cryptography. So anyway, when I look at something and say, oh, how do I get this used? How do I have the maximum public benefit for it? Then I would absolutely not consider patents. It's something where, I mean, there's other people who differ. I've heard, for example, Modi Young, cryptographer, who says he needs to have patents to make sure that he gets credit for his ideas. Um, okay, I mean, it sounds possible, and there are certainly cases where people are not giving enough credit for things. But um, if I look at what the end user needs, then it's really important to have cryptography that, like, any user wants to be able to talk to any other user. Billions of people want to be able to talk to each other on WhatsApp and so on. And then they need to be using the same cryptographic system so that like what's encrypted here ends up being decrypted there, and the users can talk to each other. And then that cryptographic system is something where it's really important for that to be secure. And for security evaluation to happen, you need to have cryptanalysts publicly looking at these systems and saying any weakness that they can find so that we don't end up using something weak. And that's something where, from the cryptanalyst perspective, they're looking at a lot of different cryptographic proposals, and they have to pick something where they're going to spend their time looking at the security of this. Maybe they'll look at several things sort of superficially, but to really carefully study something, you need to spend time. And if it's something, if there's 10 different options and 2 of them are patented, then probably those patented ones are not going to be the most popular ones, because browsers are not going to deploy something patented. And if you want something that everybody's using, then it's just less friction if you don't have patents. And then cryptanalysts know this, so they don't look at the patented things so much. They tend to focus on the things that are not patented. And that means that you have more of a chance of security if you avoid the patent. So anyway, lots of reasons that I would not consider patenting anything.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously the Klaus Schnorr patent held back zero knowledge proofs and also Ed DSA. But now it's out of patent. You now see the large scale adoption of Ed DSA. So you worked, so we moved from symmetric key. You've covered so many areas. It's not when we normally interview people that they work in elliptic curve cryptography or symmetric key or hashing or something like that. But you've worked in virtually all the areas. And elliptic curve cryptography obviously came along and really saved key exchange methods where we could drop discrete logs. But the curves that we adopted, the P256 and SEP256 key one, the Bitcoin curve, are seen as being unsafe on your website. And I know there's a history that goes back in the creation of these the curves. So do you think these curves have been cracked? What's the problem with them?
So there's a few different issues that people have with different elliptic curves. First of all, there's a non-controversial part, which is, so everybody agrees that curves have to meet certain criteria so that they're secure against some basic attacks that we know. And then if you choose a curve where, for example, the group order factors into lots of small primes, then that is definitely not secure. And that's something where, for basic elliptic curve cryptography, I should put all sorts of asterisks on this of, well, if you're doing stuff with isogenies, then you can set up a different situation. But for normal elliptic curve cryptography, what people like to use for key exchange, everybody agrees, yeah, you should have curves which follow these criteria because those deal with all of the attacks that we know. Now, beyond that, there's 2 directions where things get more controversial. One of them is regarding choices of curves which are maybe random, but maybe somebody was choosing the randomness in a kind of malicious way. And that's something where there hasn't been any serious algorithmic improvement against elliptic curves without using quantum computers if the elliptic curves are defined over prime fields. So with enough qualifiers, if you focus on what I would say is most common type of elliptic curve cryptography, then there's been nothing happening for more than 20 years now in terms of the security. I mean, people are like implementing attacks and saying, oh, we can shave off a few bit operations here and there in the attacks, but it's the security level is super stable for that type of elliptic curve cryptography. And that makes people often feel like, yeah, there's no way that you could choose a curve over a prime field which meets the standard criteria and is somehow broken. On the other hand, well, maybe the public has just given up too early. And if we actually had people focusing on trying to find other ways to break elliptic curves rather than, say, working on isogenies or other trendy topics, then maybe people would realize, oh, wait, there's something else we could do, which can break some occasional curves. And I mean, that's what happened for the standard attacks. The attacks that we know are attacks which break some curves. And some of the attacks, like the trace one attack, for example, it's a very special type of curve. And it's something where if you don't know the attack, then that curve seems fine. If you do know the attack, then that curve is something you can very quickly break. And same for the MOV attack. These are attacks which break some curves. Now, okay, suppose there's another of those. Then again, people will often say that it's just not going to happen because it's been so many years since we found the last attack. But is that because there are no more attacks, or because, well, we're just aren't looking anymore? I mean, people just are not doing research in this anymore. Well, okay, just in case, what people like to do is say, okay, we're going to choose curves in a way that you can look at the curve and say, yeah, this is definitely not something that somebody's maliciously chosen from looking at millions of possibilities until they find one which is vulnerable to some special attack that they know. And that's something where, I mean, the only case where this could matter is if somebody knows a secret attack. And again, lots of people think that wouldn't be the situation anyway. But just in case, it's good to choose curves where you can look at them and say, yeah, nobody had any flexibility here. This is not something which would let somebody choose one out of a million curves until they find one with a weakness. And that's something where, well, NSA chose elliptic curves in the 90s, where they said they were doing this, and they didn't. And that's a really weird thing. They said, oh, we're choosing this in a way that we can't target curves with a weakness. And no, actually, they can choose curves with a weakness if it's something which shows up 1 in a million, even 1 in a billion times. Then they could have targeted those curves if they knew the weakness, if there is a weakness. And they said this was pointed out by Mike Scott 20 years ago. And it's something where we know how to choose curves which just eliminate this issue. And that's something where, okay, people love to argue back and forth about this because it's something. I mean, it's again this spy versus spy thing of like, oh, does somebody know a secret attack? And what does this mean? But that's not actually the primary motivation for the Safe Curves website. The primary motivation for that is something else. So I've been talking about, are there mathematical attacks, which you look at an elliptic curve and you look at the public key, figure out the secret key, or otherwise mathematically break elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. But there's another kind of attack, which is, well, implementation attacks, where people implement elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. And we've got lots of experience with how people do that wrong. And that's something where it turns out that if you choose your curves more carefully, then you can avoid all of the major ways that people mess up their software for elliptic curve cryptography. You can have something which is simpler, harder to mess up, also faster, and it's something where people just don't do it wrong, realistically. Now, the Safe Curves website ranks elliptic curves on a bunch of criteria. Some of those are the standard criteria that everybody agrees on. There's one which is the rigidity question of, can you vary your curve choice? And that's something where, again, people love to argue about that. But what we know goes wrong, and what Safe Curves has a lot of criteria for, is when you implement these elliptic curves, then are you, for example, going to forget to check whether incoming points are on your curve? And people writing cryptographic protocols will say, oh, you have to check that your point coming in is on the curve, or they just forget about saying that and they say, oh, that was implicit because we're only looking at elliptic curve points. And then the implementer implements something, they leave out the check, whether or not it's specified, that it doesn't affect interoperability because all legitimate points are on the curve. Somebody implements elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, they forget to check the point that's coming in is on the curve, or they just weren't told to do it in the first place. And then, well, an attacker sends a bad point and then very quickly figures out the secret key. And we've seen this happening again and again and again. And it's something where when you choose a better curve, then you can avoid this problem. And so that's what safe curves, most of the safe curves criteria are about, is how do you make an implementation safe elliptic curve? And this is also, I think when people are focusing on the question of, is there a secret vulnerability, they're typically ignoring the implementation issues, which we know are much bigger issues. I mean, there could be a weakness. I mean, I don't know what to expect after more than 20 years of people looking for mathematical weaknesses, not finding them. But what we know is going wrong is implementation. So that's what safe curves is really about.
That's great because I think there is a link back to the NSA. It was an ex-NSA employee who actually created the initial specification for the seed of the curve. So there could be something around that could be a problem. So what motivated you to design Curve 25519?
Well, I actually started back in 2001. I actually implemented the NSA curves. So you were mentioning Jerry Salinas from NSA. He designed the NSA curves, which NIST standardized. And then I was implementing what seemed like maybe big enough elliptic curve just to see what it was like writing software for it and making it run quickly and correctly, of course. And it was kind of painful. And I mean, that's something where I was already seeing some of the issues that Safe Curves is covering and some other things where it felt like this is a really weird choice of what to do because Peter Montgomery, back in the 1980s, had already identified some better choices of curves, which were simultaneously simpler and faster. And why not just use those? And it's hard to imagine that NSA wasn't aware of these curves. So it's weird that they were pushing these other curves, which were painful to implement. But well, anyway, I did the work and wrote some software. This was for NIST P224. Wrote some software for a few different platforms and gave a talk about it and said at the end of the talk, this is really annoying and it would be much better to use the following Montgomery curve, which simultaneously deals with a whole bunch of issues which the NSA curves trigger. And that's something where, well, okay, the example I gave at that point was, I would say, a little bit uncomfortably small. But, well, then I was coming back to it and saying, all right, I should just do a bigger example and do some software for it carefully and deal with timing attacks and so on. And that turned into Curve 2519. So it's the same idea of anybody who actually works with the NSA NIST curves and then tries writing software for them ends up bumping into at least some of these issues. And then it's so much easier to work with Montgomery curves, which really avoid a ton of these issues.
Yeah, it's great. And obviously, you with X25519, the key exchange, we have the concept of clamping. Could you just explain what clamping involves related to Curve 25519?
Yeah, so the NIST curves, there's a few different types of those curves. And I'll say this as background and then answer your question about X25519. So there's some curves, binary curves, people call them. So curves over F2 to the N, the finite field of 2 to the N elements for some N. And then there's Koblitz curves, which are also binary, but are more specialized and allow some speedups. And that's the same Neil Koblitz we were talking about before. And then there's curves over prime fields, which that's where I was saying nothing is happening security-wise. It's very stable, which we like to see. And that's something where, okay, there's these different kinds of curves. And when people look at these curves and try putting them into protocols, then they'll often say, oh, we'll have some general purpose layer which handles any of these curves, and we'll just have a generic elliptic curve, and then you can put in whatever curve you want. It's a little bit of work to simultaneously deal with binary and prime fields, but you can do it. And one of the things you have to watch out for, and then all the standard protocols do watch out for this, is that the binary curves have, for instance, Koblitz curves will have either a 2 or a 4 dividing the group order. So if you think about an elliptic curve as just a generic group, then sometimes it'll be a prime order group. Sometimes the order, the number of points on your curve is going to be a prime times some small, people call it a cofactor, like it'll be prime times 2 or 4 or 8, something like that. And then the protocols will say, okay, we're going to do something to deal with the fact that the curves that we plug in are, well, prime times some small number, where the small number is maybe 1, 2, 4, or 8, something like that. Or it could be 12, doesn't have to be a power of 2. Now, Montgomery curves, I was singing their praises before. They have one feature which is like the Koblitz curves, that there's always going to be a 2. In fact, there's always going to be a 4 dividing the group order. So that's something where you have to take account of this in your protocols. And if you just think, okay, is the elliptic curve discrete log problem hard? And you take one of these curves and you take a point, which is, well, maybe you're doing elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman with a public key sent by an attacker. It's not necessarily in the prime order group that you thought. Even if you check that you have a point on the curve, then, well, it's still not necessarily a prime order point. And okay, you can check for order 1, the point at infinity, the 0 point in your group. But checking in general, it's another of these things that implementers don't want to bother trying to do, because it looks annoying and complicated to figure out if you have a point which is one of these like legitimate points, which is prime order. And then, okay, so somebody's implementing elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, and then they take the point. Now, the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman protocol is going to say, take your point, multiply it from the attacker, multiply it, or from the legitimate user, whatever you're receiving a point from, you're trying to set up communication, multiply that point by your secret key, which is just some integer. And then, well, the protocol will typically say, now also multiply by your cofactor, by the 2 or 4 or 8. And that has the result that whatever point you start with ends up in the prime order subgroup that you expect to work with. And if you have your secret, which is, you can think about your secret as being your original secret times this cofactor. And that's something where if you chose a secret which had a different shape, like it wasn't a multiple of the cofactor, but like +1, +2, +3, then that extra 1 or 2 or 3 seems like it'd be more randomness, more secrets. But no, that's actually public information. Somebody can figure that out from your public key. So there's no point doing that. And what clamping is doing is, well, it's simultaneously sticking that cofactor into your secret key. So it's forcing your secret key to have those extra zeros in the bit representation, which is saying, okay, it's doing what protocols are normally doing, but it's sort of building it into the system so that you automatically force all the points that you multiply by into the prime order subgroup. And it's dealing with another implementation issue. It's setting another bit, which is saying, if somebody plugs in certain textbook algorithms for doing Diffie-Hellman, then setting that extra bit is avoiding a timing leak. Now, that's something where hopefully people are not using those algorithms because they're variable time, but because they're in textbooks, it's the sort of thing where realistically, if you account for that in the system design and say, yeah, people are going to sometimes use that algorithm, then this will avoid problems. And so that's the other thing that clamping does. So it's simultaneously dealing with a protocol issue, which normally protocols do anyway, but well, just in case, let's stick it into the system design. And it's dealing with an implementation issue, which is triggered by lots of books saying, here's how you're supposed to do scalar multiplication on an elliptic curve.
That's great. Yeah, thanks very much for that. So we went from DSA to EdDSA, and it's a rather cumbersome method, but it's now standardized almost in Bitcoin and Ethereum and so on. But we're really struggling to scale it up, so it doesn't scale well with distributed signing and so on. Do you think EDDSA is a better method for scaling into the future?
So I think, I mean, there's different applications that people are interested in. I normally focus on just the really basic things like signatures and just encryption without all the, right, there's lots of fancy cryptography that's going into Bitcoin and other, I would say, more advanced blockchain technology. And then people are doing multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption. These things, there's lots of interesting cryptography that goes on beyond just the basics. Um, for the basics, for just making sure that people do things right, then, well, experience shows that EDDSA is much more robust than ECDSA. For having something which is handling all the different applications out there, I think people tend to like the Schnorr design, which is, I mean, that's the foundation of EDDSA. Depending what exactly you're doing with that, well, you might want to vary some details compared to EDDSA. I don't know any reason that people would want to use like original DSA or ECDSA. It's historical relics, and um, yeah, you were mentioning before Schnorr's patent. If that patent had not been there, then certainly Schnorr type systems would have been taking over at the beginning, and we wouldn't be talking about ECDSA at this point. Um, Bitcoin, I mean, I don't know what the motivations were for the original decision. I mean, it seems okay if you implement it correctly. That's the situation for a lot of these cryptographic protocols. A lot of the things that I worry about are realistically people don't implement things correctly. So how do we set up the cryptographic systems to avoid those problems?
That's excellent. And so you've got a long track record of leadership with in post-quantum cryptography. I think you wrote a textbook on it, and you managed to create a stateless hash-based signature method, Sphinx Plus. I remember seeing the photograph of you saying with Smash the States at a NIST presentation, which I thought was a great photograph. So how did you modify these Merkle hash-based signatures to make it stateless? I know it's a difficult question to answer, but what was the magic widget that allowed you to go from the stateful, where once you've used the private key, you can't use it again, to a stateless method?
I should give some credit first. So there's a big team involved in the Sphinx and then Sphinx Plus designs, these stateless hash-based signature schemes. And the team leader is Andy Holsing. So he had the idea of, okay, let's make this work, put everything together, and organized everything. Definitely, I think he's listed on the website as the supreme leader. And it's definitely it's not. I mean, there's some papers where it's the convention in cryptography to put names in alphabetical order, but it's not me leading it by any means. It's definitely Andy's in charge. Having said that, so the basic design of these hash-based systems, it's really inspirational. It's something where it makes you feel like, yeah, signature systems, even if all sorts of other things go wrong in cryptography, even if lots of things get broken, then we should be able to make some secure signature systems. And the reason for that confidence is these hash-based signature systems. And that's something where the basic systems, as you mentioned, you set up these trees where you have, well, a bunch of secrets at the bottom, and then you hash them to get some public information, and then hash pairs and pairs together to get smaller and smaller amounts of public information. And then, well, you can reveal to somebody, here's the public information at the top, and then you can use that to verify a chain down into any spot inside this tree. Now, of course, if you try to build this entire tree, you have to look at the entire tree. But if somebody's just wanting to verify that here's something which hashes together with this, and then you give the partners that you're hashing together, you hash all the way up the tree, you can convince somebody with just a linear computation down through the tree. Well, in terms of the total size of the tree, it's logarithmic cost instead of the whole size of the tree to verify one of these hashes. Now, the stateless issue is that in these signature systems based on the Merkle idea and the Lamport ideas and Winternitz and various other stateful hash-based signing ideas, you end up having to keep track of how many signatures you've generated, how far you've moved through your tree. And that's something where it's kind of a hassle sometimes. I mean, computers should be able to count one, two, three, et cetera. But sometimes you have like multiple virtual machines getting cloned, and then oops, they're both counting from the same number, and that can be a security problem. Um, okay, the stateless idea says, all right, let's just pick a random spot at the bottom of the tree. And what's the chance that two of those are going to bump into each other? Well, it depends how big your tree is. So if your tree is only something you can imagine looking at with say 32 nodes at the bottom and 16 and 8 and 4 and 2 and 1, then okay, as soon as you've done a couple signatures, you have a chance already if two of them bump into each other. But suppose you had a tree which is 2 to the 256 nodes at the bottom, and then 2 to the 255, 2 to the 254, etc. Well, somebody would still be able to verify going down just 256 nodes through that tree. And then you would never have, when you choose random spots at the bottom, you would never bump into, even if you had billions of signatures, you would never have billions out of 2 to the 256 bumping into each other. They would just end up being totally different spots at the bottom. So the only problem, the only reason this is a hassle is that setting up the tree, you have to do 2 to the 256 computations, which is too much. Now, there's an extra little trick, and that's a trick in some sense. It goes back to Oded Goldreich from more than 20 years ago, I think. And that's something which lets you dodge having to set up the entire tree. It lets you set up just portions of the tree that you need at each moment. And then once you've done that, you can still work with a tree that's size 2 to the 256, and you can still, the verification is just going down one path, and the signing, well, it's a little trickier. I don't want to get into all the details, but it's you can make it work, and you end up with something which is okay. It's the signatures are kind of big. If you do what Goldreich said, then you end up with a megabyte or so for your signatures, which is affordable. I mean, megabyte is a cat picture that you download. I mean, it's not that much data, but people are happier if things are smaller. So that's what Sphinx is doing. And then Sphinx Plus is saying, okay, here's some more games that you can play to shrink the size of this while still feeling like, yeah, this is all just based on, you just need a good hash function. And then, okay, I mean, you have to be careful. You can still mess up. For instance, if there's only 2 to the 60 nodes at the bottom, and then tricks, so you only have to look at pieces, so you don't have to write down all 2 to the 60, which would still be very expensive. Is that really enough? And there's various things that you have to be very careful about to make sure you don't mess up. But Sphinx and Sphinx Plus are, well, people are working on formally verifying, having computer check proofs that all the pieces fit together properly. And then as long as you plug in a good hash function, it'll be fine. And anyway, so it's an evolution of this whole long line of hash-based ideas, which produces a system where you don't have to remember where you were inside this tree. You don't have to remember how many signatures you generated. And that makes it safer for use in applications where maybe, again, your virtual machine gets cloned or you restore from a backup or something happens that messes up your counter inside your signature system.
That's great. And you've also led in terms of the key encapsulation methods, such as with the Maclise method, and which is progressing. It didn't win in the current round, but it's progressing possibly to standardization. Do you think it will ever become a standard, and what core strengths does it have? Because it does take a long time relatively to create the key. So do you think it will be standardized in the near future?
I'm optimistic. So, I mean, the situation for Maclise, it's interesting when people are talking about the size of the things. Like I was saying before, I mean, megabytes of data, you're downloading. I was just doing an update on my phone, which I don't do every day, but I mean, you're supposed to do it pretty frequently to make sure you have all the latest versions of the software. And then, like Google Maps just by itself was like 200 megabytes just for, I mean, looking at here's how much data it's downloading just to update Google Maps. And then there were like 20 different apps. I don't even use my phone that much. And it was still like gigabytes of data just for updating the application. And okay, on that scale, when you look at something like a megabyte for, as mentioned before, like the original stateless signature signatures were something like a megabyte. And well, that's it's. I mean, you can afford it if you don't do it like every second. And I mean, your typical connection is going to be depending on if you're like in a rich country where you've got your say 300 megabit per second connection and feeling like, oh, I want more so I can stream even higher resolution video, then you don't notice a megabyte. But if you're on a really low bandwidth connection, then you do notice a megabyte. I mean, smaller is better. Now, the funny thing about McLeese, for McLeese, depending on the size that you choose, if you want just like the normal size security, like it's something, well, a little stronger than AES 128. So something that's currently standard, but it's maybe not good for long term. Then for McLeese, your key is going to be a quarter megabyte. And then if you go up to a bigger size that is recommended for long term security, then we're talking a megabyte for the key. But let me point out an important difference between that and having a signature that's, say, a megabyte. If you have a megabyte for your key, somebody can be encrypting data to that key, and then somebody else can be encrypting data to that key, or somebody wants a fresh randomness as they're worried about their previous key exchange that's been compromised, and they want to send another ciphertext to that key, then they're not sending the keys again and again and again. The key is something everybody can just have a copy of the key, and then they can send as many ciphertexts as they want. You just have to broadcast a key, which is different from the situation for if you've got a typical signature scenario. People are not broadcasting signatures. People are, for phones, for example, they're checking signatures on every piece of data that you're like. This is a signature just for you. It's not a signature which is for somebody else. Or TLS, it's a signature saying I'm signing this key exchange, making sure you're talking to this server right now. And it's just for you, even though in principle signatures are something that can be verified by lots of people. It's not how they're actually used. If you say, okay, I'm going to have a long-term key, and I'm going to have everybody knows that key, and then whenever they want, they can just send ciphertext to that. Then you actually end up having most of your cost being the ciphertext, not the key, because you've broadcast your key once, and then your ciphertext is, well, every new session that you want to set up is a new ciphertext. And that's something where McLeese has very, very small ciphertext for post-quantum crypto. Your typical post-quantum system is going to have a kilobyte or more for your ciphertext. McLeese is, we're talking 200 bytes for long-term security. And that's something where it's an interesting performance balance where depending on your application, there's lots of applications where you actually end up with McLeese being more efficient than, say, a typical lattice-based system because the ciphertexts are small. Now, that's not actually my main reason for caring about the McLeese system. What motivates me to work on McLeese is that this is a system which has been around for a very long time with lots of study and a stable security level. If you plot what is the security level over time, it's basically a flat line. It's something where people have been writing papers where they're getting some tiny little bit faster in the attacks. And I mean, the original system that was proposed by McLeese, he said, well, okay, here, if you want 2 to the 64 security, which sounded like a lot of computation for an attacker back in 1978, if you want 2 to the 64 security, then here's some sizes which look good for that. And that's pretty much the situation today. If you said now, what do we want to do for 2 to the 64 security, which is not enough, but if you targeted that, you'd have basically the same key sizes that he was talking about back in 1978. And same thing for higher security levels. Long term, go for 2 to the 256. Long term security, then okay, it's bigger, but it's stably bigger. It's something where it's not that we're discovering new ideas which are reducing the security levels, which is what's happening to a lot of other post-quantum proposals. And that's something which really scares me. If people are continually reducing the security levels of their crypto systems, then it's not clear what's going to happen next. I want things to settle down, just like for elliptic curves. I mean, they're broken by quantum computers, but without quantum computers, they had this comforting feeling of if you take an elliptic curve over a prime field, then nothing's going to go wrong with it. I mean, still, just in case, try to deal with the possibility of something going wrong, but the core of that feels good. Except again, quantum computers break elliptic curves along with breaking RSA. So we need something else. And that's where McLeese has an even better track record than elliptic curves. It goes back even farther than elliptic curves do. And it's held up better because, well, quantum computers don't do anything to it. It's like for AES that people will say sometimes you need to go from AS 128 to AS 256 because quantum computers, they'll do some square root attack, which chops your key sizes in half. It's actually, there's various overheads. So it's not, you don't need to go that high for security, but it's a simple way to say, okay, I mean, worst case, what quantum computers are doing to AES, you can easily protect yourself by going up to 256 bit keys. And then, well, McLeese, the same basic feeling of there's this big combinatorial search happening inside the attacks. And then, well, quantum computers can, in principle, do quantum searches. There's maybe some big overhead, but if you go for 256, then you're safe. You're safe. Nothing's going to happen, and that's again a comforting feeling. Which for me, that's what has motivated me to work on McLeese. Is that it feels like if you actually care about security and you don't want to just keep upgrading all the time, then this is the right thing to be using. And in general, I mean, look, if the only way to get something deployed in an application is to use something riskier, then it's better than doing nothing, better than not protecting against quantum computers. But I think the foundation of security should be something that we have the maximum trust in. And that's what motivates me to work on the McLeese crypto system.
It's great. And you've been quite critical of Kyber being selected over NTRU. What's the core weaknesses do you see in Kyber?
Patents. That's the big thing. I mean, there's
Yeah.
like, lattice-based systems like Kyber and Entru. These do not have the same kind of comforting track record as the McLeese system. So from a pure security perspective, I feel like kind of scared. I worry that the security levels haven't settled down. But the big obvious issue between Kyber and Entru, if you feel like you need a system which fits into a kilobyte for your keys, and okay, you're willing to do a kilobyte for your ciphertext, then Kyber is in the middle of this patent minefield where Entru is not. The original Entru system was patented in 1996, and patents last for, well, 20 years, plus they can get extended a little bit, but I mean, there's this patent term adjustment. If the patent office says that they were responsible for some slowdowns in getting a patent granted, then they can go a little past 20 years. But basically, a patent lasts for 20 years. And the Entru patent was filed in 1996 and expired in 2017. And okay, so the basic Entru design is free. Now, what people are currently looking at for Entru and have deployed in some applications, it's a little different from the original 1990s system. For example, it's bigger and avoids some other, because the security levels have been dropping. This is, again, lattices are worrisome, but if you keep up with the attacks and feel like here's something big enough, then there's still some little changes from the original 1990s version of Entru. Hopefully those changes are not patented. Nobody's aware of problems there. The difference for Kyber is so after Entru, there was, well, various changes made by people coming up with different kinds of lattice-based systems. And there's one particular type of, it's an interesting design from 2010, which people credit to Lubashevsky, Peikert, and Regev. And they sent the final version of their paper, which they had not put online, to the publisher of that paper a week after the same system had a patent application filed by Gaboury and Aguilar-Melchior. Now, I mean, if it hadn't been for the patent, then things might still be okay, but probably not, because other people looked at that system and said, oh, this is interesting, and here's some other things I can do. So in 2012, there was another patent filed by Jintai Ding, and then more patents. So for instance, there's several patents filed by Yunlei Zhao in 2017. And all of these are before Kyber appeared. Some of them clearly apply to Kyber. Some of them, it's not clear. Like the Yunlei Zhao patents, Yunlei Zhao has a statement online saying Kyber is covered by his patents. I'm not sure. I look at this patent, it's a bunch of Chinese. Google Translate is not clear enough on what's going on in that patent. And I mean, I know something about how to evaluate patents, but the language barrier here is a problem. And if you're close to what a patent is doing, then courts will sometimes creatively expand the patent. They're kind of biased towards patent holders. Anyway, so there's a bunch of patents. Now, NIST bought the first two patents, which are things that people worried about for Kyber. So this 2010 patent, NIST bought that patent. They bought a license which is supposed to allow free use of Kyber as soon as NIST issues a standard, which is in a month or two. And also the second patent, so the Ding patent, NIST has bought a license for that. They haven't put the signed license statements online, but from some information they've provided, it sounds like things are okay with those patents. So if it were just those two patents, then okay, it looks like Kyber would be fine. But then there's a bunch more patents, and the situation that I've been seeing looks like I would describe it as sort of typical academic situation of ignoring patents. Like, oh, they're, I just want to do my work and not worry about patents. Well, when people are more worried about what's going on in the real world, then you do start worrying about patents. And what's necessary is for somebody to go really carefully through these patents, which are before Kyber appeared, and say, okay, do any of these patents, like evaluated the way that a patent lawsuit would evaluate them, do any of these patents actually have a risk of covering Kyber? And if so, then, well, somebody should do something about that. Where, I mean, the easy thing to do is use Entru, but maybe it's possible to buy out those patents as well. It's when I look at these designs, I mean, there's some interesting little differences between the Entru design and these follow-ups, like the LPR design from 2010. And then Kyber makes its own interesting little changes. And I mean, if you're trying to get the best cryptographic system, then totally makes sense to look at every little detail and try to change things. I'm not sure that all the changes that were made from the original Entru are good. In fact, some of them actually worry me from a security perspective, beyond just the basic worried about lattices being broken. But the big obvious thing is patents, and we've already had years of delay of rolling out NIST post-quantum crypto because NIST picked Kyber instead of picking Entru. They could have, in 2021, they had their deadline for input, and they could have said, okay, like a month after that, they could have said, everything's fine, we're going ahead with Entru, just roll it out. And then there would have been years of user data which would have been encrypted with Entru, which have not been encrypted because people are sitting there waiting for the patent situation to resolve. And that's really unhappy. I mean, assuming that quantum computers get built in some number of years, not too distant future, and assuming that some of the data that's been sent last year, the year before, data being sent today, is still something that users want to be confidential in whatever number of years when the attacker has a quantum computer, then we have a security problem right now. And this is something where we're really messing up from a security perspective in waiting for years and rolling something out. So that's the thing that makes me say NIST really should have chosen Entru rather than Kyber, just because of the patent mess. They would have had much faster deployment if they had done that.
That's great. And it seems like every week we're seeing papers that are cracking lattices and learning with errors, and it could take months or even years to even read some of these papers. And while that's happening, there's a panic. People are worried about using Kyber and so on. So do you think lattice methods will stand up? I know it's difficult for you to say, but do you think that there could be something that happens in the next few years that will fundamentally crack lattice?
I don't know. It's something where it's funny. There was a big fuss about one particular paper recently, which is one of many lattice attack papers. This one was I would say making bolder claims than a typical attack paper is improving somewhat compared to previous papers. And then when this happens again and again 50 times, then you can get a big change in security levels. This paper was saying, hey, we're doing a big jump, which sometimes happens, and sometimes it's actually legitimate. Give me a second to drink something. This paper was saying using a new kind of quantum algorithm that it could do a big jump downwards in what's called the approximation factor for breaking a lattice system. Now, this is something where lots of people started reading through, and it took about 8-9 days until a serious mistake was announced. And the author then said, okay, don't know how to fix that mistake. And yeah, here's what the mistake is. Don't know how to fix it. So withdrawing the paper. The thing that's funny in the time between the paper being announced and the bug being found, you would think that if there were any like really solid reason to say, look, lattices must be secure, then you would think somebody would have said, well, look, here's why this paper can't work. But that's not what happened. What happened was there were some people saying, look, we've seen mistakes in some attack papers before. And I mean, Shor, who had the fundamental attack algorithm using quantum computers, he had a wrong paper, which was attacking lattices from 5 years ago. And that's something where people make mistakes. And then, well, okay, this new paper, when it just came out, some people were saying, oh, yeah, look, there have been mistakes before. And so, like, really important to read through. And nobody was saying, well, look, this can't work because here's some really fundamental reason it can't work. It's all of these crypto systems, people, if they're saying we're confident in these crypto systems, then, well, I can't endorse that. I feel like the only way that we know the security level of a crypto system is having enough people really, really trying to attack it. And then when there's improvements in the attacks, continuing to explore and say, okay, what further improvements can we do? What have we missed? What have we not explored? And then waiting for that to settle down and feeling like, yeah, here's like, we've been really bashing at this for many years and it's stable. And now for lattices, the thing is, there have been all these attacks which have been reducing the security level, reducing it, where each one feels like, yeah, okay, you can just make somewhat bigger keys and then everything's fine. And maybe it comes to an end at some point. And okay, great. But that hasn't happened yet. There's in the past year, there's several lattice papers. Not this particular one used quantum techniques that turned out to be wrong. I mean, it's not at all the only thing happening with lattice. And so my feeling about how to choose a crypto system safely is have people really try everything they can and then watch what's happening there and wait for it to stabilize. And if it hasn't stabilized because there have been changes like what's happened for lattices, even with this one paper failing and some other previous papers failing, there at the same time, there have been 50 other papers which have been reducing the security levels of lattices. And that's something where it's scary. So if you're going to use lattices, then, well, take the biggest security level that you can, or preferably use a system which has actually been studied seriously and has a stable security level. So what's going to happen with lattices? Okay, I'll make a concrete prediction, which is I expect that Kyber 512 will not reach its claimed security level. Kyber 768, significantly bigger. Hopefully it holds up. I wouldn't want to place bets either way on that. Kyber 1024, another big jump up, and that's the biggest you can get from Kyber. Hopefully it's okay. But I mean, there's no substitute for actually looking for the attack algorithms and saying, okay, how can we improve the attacks against these systems? And until that's settled down, then nobody knows what the results are going to be.
That's great. And in the competition for NIST, I think we saw some of the methods fall at the different stages. The oil and vinegar method of Rainbow was cracked very quickly. And then we saw isogenes, which was the great dream that we could still be using elliptic curves, fell at the last fence with Psych and SIDH. Do you think there's any chance for isogenes to come back again?
Yeah, so psych is actually it's a funny mistake. This is something where the basic idea of using isogenies in crypto goes back to the 90s, although it wasn't published at that point. The first publication was in 2004 by Rostovtsev and Stolbanov. And they said, hey, here's a nice, simple way to use isogenies, where simple is like assuming you know the math, where here's what an isogeny is. Then beyond that, saying, here's a crypto system based on that. They said, this is a nice, simple thing to do and looks secure. And then the person who had thought about it in the 90s but didn't publish it, Kubenia, he put a paper online in 2006. The 2004 publication, that was in Russian, which might have limited the readership, and then with English in 2006. Google Translate was not working so well back then. Alta Vista had a translation. Well, anyway. So by 2006, there were these papers saying, here's a nice, simple way to use isogenies once you know what isogenies are to do a crypto system. It's a little more complicated than doing elliptic curves once you know what elliptic curves are. Like getting up to what isogenies are, it's another step up from elliptic curves. But with the math in place, then it's like, yeah, this is a nice little crypto system. And then a few years later, there was a paper saying, well, the security level of this is not what you expect. You need your key sizes to grow instead of linearly with the security level that you want. You need them to grow more like quadratically with the security level that you want. And the reason for that, against quantum computers, the reason for that is the quantum algorithm due to Kuiperberg, which you can apply with enough work to these isogeny-based systems. And then, well, some of the authors of that attack and coworkers came up with the SIDH and then psych approaches, which are saying, well, okay, we can avoid the issue that seems to be showing up for these isogeny-based systems by putting in an extra complication, which people typically call that complication the torsion point. So this is some extra information that you send in psych. SIDH and psych, which lets you sort of work around the attacks and made them feel like, okay, with like a somewhat different crypto system design, extra complication, extra information released, then you can build an isogeny system which felt like it was not vulnerable to that attack from 2010. Okay, problem is that it turned out that extra information, these torsion points, it turned out that those allowed an attack. And a really devastating attack, much worse than saying your key size has to go up quadratically. This is like your key size has to go up to ridiculous levels. And so, okay, SIDH and psych, a lot of attacks are not that devastating. Like, I mean, you mentioned Rainbow as something that got attacked. That's something where if you take the higher security levels, it seems okay. Psych, if you take the highest security level, then I think there was a paper breaking it in 11 seconds. It's really, security just completely collapsed. And that's something where, well, it's given kind of a bad name to isogenies. And in some sense, well, if you, like if people say, oh, we like isogenies, and then some isogeny-based system gets smashed, then you have to wonder what are those people doing? Are they paying attention to the security of their systems? The thing is that the attack against SIDH and psych, it's really relying on this change to use torsion points. And so far, nobody's been able to see any way to apply it to the simpler systems from 2004. And if you just use isogenies in the simplest way, then, well, there's still the attack from 2010, Kuiperberg's algorithm, using a quantum computer. You need your key sizes to be maybe bigger than you thought, depending exactly how efficient your quantum attack is. But that's not a devastating attack. And the simplicity of that feels good. It makes you feel like you can see more of the attack avenues when you're trying to come up with attacks against the system. Then having these complications like torsion points, it's a worrisome feeling about a system. So these other isogeny-based systems, the sort of older style of isogeny-based systems, then got a big boost with something called Seaside. And that was in, I think, end of 2018. And that's a way to, I would say, dramatically speed up the 2004 style isogeny-based crypto systems and still feel like it's the same simple kind of thing. One extra little trick, but nothing like releasing the torsion point information or the sort of weirdnesses happening in psych. Seaside feels like a conventional kind of isogeny-based crypto system, and that one is fast enough that you can actually, well, use it in some applications, and people have been looking at more ways to speed it up and more ways to uh, vary it, adapt it to different situations. One of the most interesting features of these basic isogeny-based crypto systems, including the 2004 one and Seaside and other variants, is that these actually give you non-interactive key exchange, like the original Diffie-Hellman system. You can have like each user says, here's my public key, and you broadcast all those public keys, put them in a big database, and then every pair of users then magically shares a secret. And that's something where we don't have many ways to do that in post-quantum crypto. It's a really basic tool in pre-quantum crypto, but in post-quantum crypto, it's something where if you try to do that with lattices, it's pretty painful, and there's basically nothing that works like traditional Diffie-Hellman except for these isogeny-based systems. And okay, they're secure, but they're providing an interesting this interesting functionality, which if they're secure, then well, it's sort of the only game in town for doing non-interactive key exchange. For getting something like basic encryption and signatures, what I focus on making sure that we're secure with those, including against quantum computers. I feel like these are way too new. I mean, even something from 2004, I would not trust these systems. It's just not enough study and need more work to be confident in isogenies. So I would not recommend deploying isogenies unless you absolutely have to, because you're in a situation where you need non-interactive key exchange or something else that isogenies provide that basically nothing else provides. So for getting something out there, which is like encryption or signatures, then I would say use the like chems. For security, I would say use McLeese for encryption. If you really need smaller keys, then use some lattice-based system, but the biggest one you can get your hands on. For signatures, well, hash-based, it seems small enough that it can fit pretty much anywhere, so that's an easy answer there. But if you need non-interactive key exchange, then, well, it's good for people to be looking at, all right, what's going on with Seaside and these other isogeny-based systems. And maybe they'll hold up. I mean, if I look back at crypto systems from the 90s, not all of them have been broken. And crypto systems from the what do you call the like first decade of the 2000s, some are broken, some are not. So I mean, maybe things hold up. I feel better with a system which has a long history and a lot of study, and isogenies are definitely not there. But maybe after enough research, maybe we start feeling like, yeah, they've been around long enough. We've really tried everything, and we can trust these.
That's great. So my favorite paper at the current time is the paper you published in the first edition of the Journal of Cryptology around the review of NIST competitions, and you highlight, you pick the whole history of all the competitions and all the problems that were caused. What fundamental problems have you found in those competitions, and how best can we overcome these problems in the future?
Well, it's tempting to say patents, but no. I think it's a tough problem that people are facing when they're trying to pick a crypto system. I mean, there's lots of endeavors where you're sort of seeing the results that you work on something. For instance, suppose you're trying to make a faster car. And there's people who work on that, and then they race the cars, and the cars go super fast speed, and wow, and then if they've done something better, then they know they've done it better, or something more environmentally friendly. Suppose you're making some more energy efficient car, or a bus, or I mean, people who are working on improving the efficiency of things, then they measure what they're doing, and sometimes there's multiple measurements, and it's complicated to say what's the most important. But I mean, you're making something less expensive or faster, and you see the results. Now, in cryptography, basic problem is you don't see the results. I mean, you see the speed. So just like in any other efficiency oriented thing, you can see how fast your cryptography is. And that's great. It gives you a way to decide, here's the smallest or the fastest. I mean, again, there's multiple ways to measure the performance, but what you can't see is the security. And I mean, you can look at a system and say, well, here's some attacks and here's some simple attacks. So the security, like you can definitely break it in time two to the very big number. And then you write down five different attacks and the numbers are all satisfactorily large. But you can't see if there's some better attack. The only way to figure that out is to say, okay, get enough people looking that you start feeling like, yeah, we shouldn't have missed anything big. And okay, a cryptographic competition, if the objective is to say we want something that's fastest, and then, okay, I mean, you can do that. And that's how a lot of things work. You can just figure out what metrics you're interested in. And if there's a trade off, like I was mentioning before, big keys, smaller ciphertext, then some applications that's better, some it's worse. Anyway, you can measure this sort of thing, and it gives you a way to decide. But if your concern is security, then the lack of visibility is a real problem. And so what I'm doing in this paper that you mentioned is I'm going through reviewing what happened in various cryptographic competitions. Not the post-quantum one because that one is, I mean, still ongoing. But various completed competitions saying, okay, so what happened in these competitions? How were decisions made? And what do we know about how well they held up? And well, a big chunk of the paper is about speed and how those speed decisions are made because it really does play a big role in these cryptographic competitions. And then the tougher part is about security. And the interaction between speed and security is kind of complicated. And this is something where, I mean, if you imagine key sizes like RSA 512 is it's faster than RSA 1024, but it's not secure. RSA 1024 is also breakable for lower cost than Bitcoin. So I mean, RSA 1024 you also should not be using it. Eventually, you get to some point where you feel comfortable about the security, but well, then quantum computers come along. Okay, you take some post quantum system, and again, you feel like okay, we're probably safer if we take bigger keys. There's lots of attacks which don't run in 11 seconds against the biggest sizes. There's lots of attacks which they reduce security levels, but they don't immediately break everything. And then, okay, if you move up to bigger key sizes, you're protecting yourself against moderate attack improvement. But is there a bigger attack improvement? It's something where, well, we don't know. And how do you evaluate that during a competition? It's a really tough question. So what I'm doing in that paper is going through what people have tried and in various competitions, how did these criteria get, how did they interact? How did they get applied to the submissions to these competitions? And I don't think we're at a point of knowing the perfect answer. I think there's some things where it's clear that there's some things that competitions can do wrong, and it's clear how those things can be fixed. But there's other things where it's just a fundamentally hard problem to figure out what's secure. And the things that make me feel most comfortable, like things that have been around for many years, lots of attacks, and the security level stable. Well, you can't wait for decades inside a competition if you want to select something and roll it out. So what do you do? Not an easy question.
Yeah. I suppose the one problem is the scorecard approach. So we saw that with Rendal against Serpent. Unfortunately, we lost Ross Anderson just a few weeks ago, and where just a few little tweaks allowed Rendal to beat Serpent because it was better in software implementation or something like that. But the security level was probably ratcheted up too high, which brought the performance down. It's almost like the tweaking. I think the same thing happened with SHA-3, where Blake 3 has come through and has been shown to be faster. Just keep tweaking. It's almost like we standardize something and we almost like fossilize it. So I suppose the scorecard approach and how you balance the scorecard is a difficult thing because maybe something that wins but doesn't win in any real area but does well across the scorecard is going to be the winner. So you have analyzed the post-quantum cryptography competition. uh, for NSA interactions. I don't know how best to put this, but was there interference? So it has been seen in the past that the NSA did have some influence in this standard that was discovered. But I think you've probed into the post-quantum cryptography competition and you saw some signs of the NSA. Do you think there's anything that needs to be answered in that?
Well, in principle, the rules for the competition, the rules for the NIST competition said that it would be open and transparent. And so I would say everything should have been online to begin with. But, well, 2 years ago now, filed a FOIA request. Actually, even the year before, I'd started filing some FOIA requests because it was really puzzling what was going on. And I mean, I tried asking uh, questions like what's going on here, and was kind of surprised by not getting answers to some things. So in the US, there's FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, which is saying that you can ask a government agency, hey, please show me your records on whatever. And I mean, of course, there's some exceptions to it. Like you can't probe people's medical information just because they're government agency or something. But I mean, again, for this competition, since it said from the beginning that I mean, transparency was part of the rules. It's weird that not everything was online, including, I mean, whatever communication there was with NSA, that should have been online from the beginning. But well, okay, so I filed this request, and then NIST stonewalled, and eventually I sued, and then NIST started providing records. Now that's been a slow process because in FOIA lawsuits, well, the judges don't say, okay, look, government, you have to drop everything you're doing and immediately provide all of your records. They are okay with, all right, try to catch up at some reasonable speed, providing the records that you should have been providing. So NIST has been slowly providing records regarding the post-quantum competition, which show, for example, that back in 2016, when they announced the competition, the pqc at nist.gov email address had more NSA recipients than NIST recipients. Now, the details of what NIST and NSA have discussed, there's a few bits in the records that have been disclosed so far. I think there's a lot more that still has not been disclosed. And until the complete records are public, then it's hard to evaluate what the impact was of NSA's involvement. I mean, there are various interesting records. I mean, NSA is, if you just say, for instance, what were the communications directly between NIST and NSA, then that would be missing if there's like NIST. If you look back at the dual EC incident, then this is where there was, so according to the Snowden documents in 2013, as reported by the New York Times, the dual EC standard from NIST was backdoored by NSA. The possibility of this happening is something that had been discovered earlier, but the fact that it did happen, that's something which was, well, reported in 2013. And then if you go back through the records of, eventually NIST was forced to provide basically all of their records regarding what happened with dual EC. If you look at those records, where did NIST get the dual EC design from? Then, well, it was provided by a contractor originally, not by NSA. Now, there were subsequent discussions between NSA and NIST. And so seeing the NSA NIST communication does provide some information. But, well, if you imagine an attacker trying to subvert a standardization process, hypothetically, then that won't necessarily be some obvious communication straight from the attacker to the standardization organization. It's something where you also have to look at indirect paths, as happened again with dual EC. Now, look, has anything particularly bad happened aside from the patent situation? Well, there's nothing in public which is clearly a problem aside from years of delay because of the patent mess surrounding Kyber. hopefully everything's okay. But it's weird that a competition which is supposed to be done in an open and transparent way with traceability says so that everybody can see what happened and why it happened. I mean, if that's the rules for a competition, then where are those records? It's weird that those records are not just online in the first place. And having to pull teeth in order to get these records is not how things should be working.
And so what does the next decade look like in cryptography? What do you think are the main problems to solve?
Well, there's lots of things happening. I think, again, cryptographers work on lots of different topics. Many of them, most cryptographers, I would say, work on more advanced kinds of cryptographic functionality than the really basic things that I like encryption and signatures. Um, and if you're trying to do some fancy cryptographic feature, then you need those things happening. And that's clearly a growth area, and it's something where the more complicated, fancier cryptographic features also have more ways to mess up. And so it's really important for those things to be studied carefully. I think down at the encryption and signatures level, I think there's still some work required to really feel like, yeah, we've got solid stuff that we're happy with. Um, I like one particular direction, which I think when I first heard about it, I felt like it sounded super painful. And I think because people were saying it's like, oh, so much work. And my current feeling is actually it's not that much work, and more people should be doing it and just ignoring the reputation of it being painful, which is having a computer checking proofs of, for example, software working correctly, or to the extent that there are proofs of some aspects of security of cryptographic systems, having a computer check those proofs, it's so much more reliable than having a human check proofs. And well, okay, explaining a proof to a computer, it does take more work than writing a proof in the normal way, but it's not super painful. It's like a little bit painful maybe, but it's not that bad. It's not that much work. And and when you get into it's actually for people who like certain kinds of programming, it's actually a lot of fun to be putting these things together, even when it takes some time to do. So I've had at this point 4 projects where for each project it was like months of work doing the research, and then a few weeks extra for doing a computer checked proof of main theorem in that. And that's okay. It's some extra time, but I mean, while I was doing that work, I was also feeling like oh, this is getting somewhere, and like each step was something with the computer checking each. Like you explain something to the computer, it checks it, and then you're just super confident it's true at that point. And then you explain the next step, and super confident that's true. And so there's something nice about getting that done, and then the results are so much more confidence inspiring than a typical proof. So a lot of the software problems that we're facing, I think, can be dealt with by saying, okay, let's really move from the current world of software where, yeah, maybe there's been some audits, but there can still be all sorts of bugs lurking in that. Doing the extra step to let's have a computer checking a proof that the software works correctly, has the features that we want the software to have. That's something which it's really not that painful, and so I expect a lot more of that. It's something which has been happening. Quite a few people have been doing computer check proofs of things relevant to cryptography, and also lots of other kinds of math and computer science. There's more and more computer check proofs, and it's I think really important trend. And then the effect on cryptography, I think, is really important. That we're going to be in a world where we can actually say, hey, this cryptographic software works. Even when people have lots of different pieces of software optimized for different environments, all of them are going to feel like, yeah, we've got a computer which knows not just testing some occasional inputs, but really checking a proof that they work for all possible inputs. And that takes away a huge part of the attack surface for cryptography. So I think that's a really important trend.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And obviously, with homomorphic encryption increasing, you can't really check that the computation has been done correctly. So you do need proofs for that. And proof of deletion, if a citizen wants their data deleted from a machine learning model or something, can you create a cryptographic proof? So I think in machine learning,
Oh, no,
you'll see a
that's,
lot.
that's, that's just never going to happen. Sorry. You're
Yeah,
never going to get the
no,
data deleted from AI. It's just
that's right.
not.
That's, that's true. And if you could change one thing about your career, what would it have been?
I think it's been good. I mean, look, there's lots of little things where there's some there are lots of times when I mean I'm reading about things that people have come up with and feeling like this is a nice tool that um, uh, like a sort of add what they're explaining to my toolbox so that when I run into that situation then I can apply that tool. And there's definitely been times when I felt like here's something which if I had known this, like if I'd just been aware that this thing was there years earlier, I could have been using it in this project. I could have saved quite a bit of time, and that's something where. So, for instance, computer check proofs. I wish I had started on sooner because it's really it's not as painful as not nearly as painful as people describe, and it can actually be fun, and it's just not that much work. Um, and I was deterred by believing what people said about this is super painful to do. And there's various other smaller things where it's just I think if I'd read more broadly and in some cases been more skeptical about people saying we don't think this is useful because there's some alarm bells that I've learned over the years. Like if somebody says something's bad because and then they give some unquantified description of why it's supposed to be bad, then that for me is an alarm bell where I could have learned this years earlier. And if I'd learned it years earlier, then there's lots of things that I would have been looking at more closely, which I kind of skipped over, and that would have saved time. But anyway, I mean, overall, I'm happy with the general like uh, reading stuff and thinking about stuff, writing stuff. It's fun. So
Yeah. Well, we spoke to Jan Kamenisch the other week, and he moved into industry, so he could have had an amazing academic career. But and I see a lot of cryptographers moving into industry because those skills really aren't there that industry really needs. So why have you stayed in academia and not moved into industry?
well, look, I mean, industry. So positives, obviously, it's. I mean, the salaries are better than in academia, and lots of people getting rich off of blockchain technologies. It's sometimes so. I've heard from some people working in industry where they feel like they have more freedom than in academia, and um, I've heard from some people where they feel like they have less, and that's something where I don't know what it would have been like if I decided on an industry job from the beginning. Um, in grad school, I was thinking if the whole math professor thing doesn't work out, then well, I can always just go write video games. That's a fun thing to do too, and I don't know what it would have been like. Um, I did spend some summers at a research institute, and in general, people seemed to be enjoying it. And there were some people who very much did not like public speaking, for example, or I mean, giving talks. And I think that makes it very difficult to have an academic job. Um, and so for those people, it's clear that industry research was the right option. Um, and then there's other people who, yeah, I think could have been happy in multiple environments, and I think it's hard to tell what would have been best. But um, I, I mean, in general, the advertisement for academia is well, it's intellectual freedom to think about what you want and work on what you want, and you don't have anybody who's telling you, oh, you must do this. Uh, of course, Google will then say, well, yeah, we give our employees 1 day a week to do whatever they want, and I mean, we're giving them interesting problems anyway. But on top of that, spend every Friday thinking about whatever you want. That's fine. Um, so I mean, there are definitely people I've heard from who are happy in industry jobs, and I think, I mean, for me, it's been like academia as the sort of default choice, but could have been okay otherwise. I don't know.
Yeah. And so we now see these paper mills happening where people can, researchers can publish any any papers that they want. Their view times are measured sometimes in days, and I think you want to find it's publish or perish. Do you think there's too much pressure around publishing? There's not enough thinking time. Well, do you think academia is changing to become more of a machine rather than something that's driven by human creativity?
Yes and no. So I think, look, there are definitely people who will look at an academic CV and say, all right, we're going to measure it by the number of papers. And then there will be other people who say, wait. That does allow what you're describing of these paper mills where you can just publish papers where nobody's even looking at the paper. Um, and so then people will start saying, well, okay, we're going to have this ranking of like, here's the acceptable publication venues, the journals or conferences, depending on like math is more journal oriented, computer science tends to be more conference oriented, but whichever kinds of venues say, these are the journals or conferences which are serious about reviewing and say, okay, we only want stuff which is good stuff. Of course, there's always some guesswork when a reviewer is looking at a paper. They don't know how important it's going to end up being. They sort of guess and say, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And then they can be surprised 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later that their guesses were too optimistic or too pessimistic about the paper. Um, but okay, so then people will look at a CV and say, all right, how good are the venues where you've put this work? And then other people will say, well, wait, this still rewards papers that are like just barely good enough for those venues, but then just not having the really spectacular papers that are really, really influential, which and sometimes you want to sit there thinking more about something and it can be more work. There's definitely some papers where I felt like I am putting much more work into this than necessary for getting it published. But I feel like I really want to understand this and I really want to get this right. And it's going to be useful if I get this right. And that's something where it's hard to measure that. One way that people have tried is saying, okay, you have to present on your CV or something else where you're advertising yourself. You have to present your top 5 publications. And then that means that churning out more and more papers doesn't help because, I mean, unless they're your best ones, your most influential ones. And then in the end, well, yeah, there's pressure in academia to publish. Most obviously for grants that when grant reviewers are looking at things, then they'll say, hey, we want to have grant funding going to support people who are most productive at producing new research, influential research. And then reviewers for grants will have different ideas of how to evaluate that. Um, and so in some sense, I mean, it's like industry of somebody is telling you what to do, but it's much less direct. In academia, if you say, okay, I can think about some other thing which I just find interesting, and then I don't find myself day by day saying, oh, this is something where it's really important for me to tune what I'm thinking about because this is what's going to make some reviewers happy. It's in a typical day, I'm thinking about what I find interesting and then um, trying to see what I can do, which is making a difference.
It's great. And my last question, I'm sorry I've kept you for so long. You have so many areas that we could investigate. I think we've scratched the surface, unfortunately. So, what advice would you give to graduates who are near to graduation about the skills and the knowledge that they need to pick up? Remembering that we're now in an era of AI and so on. What skills do you think they need for the future?
You mean in cryptography, particularly,
In
or
cryptography and maths and engineering, what advice would you give students?
well, that's a tough one. I mean, obviously, it's trendy to have AI experience. I mean, if you're looking for what people will look at and say, "Oh, yes, that's a skill that we expect people to have," then um, there's, I mean, I tend to look at areas which are sufficiently focused that if you just say, "Oh, generically, let's try AI," then I mean, sometimes it can do something useful, but there's many more specific skills which I think are useful. So within cryptography, there's different cultures. On the math side, people tend to be going for, okay, do you have the ability to write down security proofs, or do you have the ability to break crypto systems? And those are different skills where writing down a security proof, it can sometimes involve some mathematics where you're sort of trying to figure out how the mathematical pieces fit together in order to say that if you have an attack against this system, you can transform it into an attack against that system. But it tends to be very different from if you're using math to break a system, then you tend to have something which is, well, it feels sharper in the sense of you're pinpointing something about the system which is not the generic level that you see in a proof. It's something where you end up isolating some particular feature of a system which you then, well, you might need all sorts of random pieces of math which you wouldn't have expected to apply. But people will sometimes say, oh, it's important to have statistics or number theory or various other pieces of math. But my experience is that for attacking things, it's kind of random what ends up being used. And then if you know some particular areas of math, that can be useful. And then you can say, how can I use this in cryptography for proving things or for breaking things? But it's more important to have the sort of generalist skill, I would say, of being able to look at it, if you want to break things, look at an attack target and say, right, what math do I need in order to make some progress against this target? And the best way to demonstrate that is try some projects, break some things, and then it's sort of like an artist putting together a portfolio. If you, or I mean, people have, like for programming, people will have, here's my portfolio of software that I've written, like here's my GitHub repos, and this is something where that people can look at that and say, yeah, okay, so you've demonstrated your ability to tackle different kinds of problems. And then, so this was mostly about the math side. On the sort of programming software side of cryptography, that I would say is well, it's more like normal programming, except there's some weird features of cryptography, like all this math showing up. And I mean, you have to show that you can do software kind of stuff and not be afraid of the math. You don't need as much math as you do to end up breaking something or to do a security proof. But you do need to be comfortable working with mathematical objects and then doing some software for that. And this is something most students are focused on some particular piece of these areas. Like they like building software, for example, or they like creating security proofs, or they like breaking things. And it's unusual for somebody to have skills crossing these areas. But within these, you can try different kinds of problems and show that you're capable of solving some different kinds of problems. And that's what people will be looking at for deciding whether to give you a job.
I completely agree, and you'll start in one of those areas, and then hopefully your learning will move you into the other area too, because you're dealing with dangerous material. Hazmat, I think, is one of the terms that they use in the Python cryptography, which is hazardous materials that you're dealing with. These are dangerous functions, and you need to watch what you do with them. So thanks very much, Daniel. I'm so sorry it took twice as long than I expected, but thanks for giving up 2 hours of your precious time. And hopefully, if you're over in the UK, you'll be able to come to the beautiful city of Edinburgh and maybe speak to our students sometime. But thank you so much, and keep up the great work that you're doing. Thank you.